We have arrived at the end of our first unit. For weeks now, we've been familiarizing ourselves with various aspects of the free atonal style and learning tools to analyze this music. And now it is time to put it all together, to apply our tools to the analysis of full pieces of atonal music. But how do you actually go about doing that? How do you confront an unfamiliar atonal piece and assemble an analysis of it? How do you know what to look for? In real analysis, there are seldom right ways to look at a piece or correct answers. Analysis is really a creative endeavor where you work out how you relate to a piece of music, how you hear it, and then put together an argument that helps someone else hear it the way that you do. As the music theorist David Lewin once said, every valid analytic statement is of the basic form, I hear this about this specific piece, as qualified by an implicit, and I think you can too. Through analysis, you come to know how you yourself hear music, and you learn how to share your way of hearing with others. So I can't tell you how to find the right analysis of a piece of music, because there is no such thing. But what I can do is try to show you some good working habits for making your own analyses. Most of the time, in class or in videos, I have an analysis in mind already that I try to present to you or guide you to in an understandable way. But in this video, I'm going to instead imagine that I've opened up an exam to find a totally unfamiliar piece, and it is my job to write a 3 to 5 page double-spaced essay on that piece. What do I do first? How do I discover what I hear? How do I build up a collection of observations to use in my essay? Let's explore that by drawing up an analysis of an orchestral song by Alban Berg, the second song in his Altenberg-Lieder set, a song whose German title I am now going to butcher, Sahst du nach dem Gewitterregen den Wald. By working out how I'd approach this analysis, I hope to communicate a good working method for analyzing atonal song. And I should note right at the outset that this should not be confused with a template for the essay itself. What I'm talking about is how to find data or evidence, not how to present it in an essay form. So at the end of this video, you should hopefully have a good sense of how to assemble a compelling set of observations about a piece of music. In the process, we will both synthesize many of the tools we have learned about over the preceding weeks, while also peeking in at some of the new tools presented to you in Chapter 3 of the Strauss. Because this video is about the process of analysis, it is far more loosely structured than most of my videos. When I say that I'm walking you through how I'd analyze this piece of music, I really mean it. I've never listened to this piece before, and I honestly have no clue what I'm going to find. This is very honestly how I go about doing analysis. And analysis is a pretty slow, messy business. I hope that seeing that process will be useful to you as you prepare for your exam this week. But I also understand that the result may seem a bit tedious and unhelpful to some. It's also, as you can probably tell, way longer than usual. For those who only wish to get what you need to complete this week's JIT, you can go to this timestamp and then safely leave the rest of the video unwatched. But for those who may be a bit nervous about how to approach this unit's exam, the rest of this video is for you. So let's jump in. Before I say where to start, first let me say how you shouldn't start. You definitely shouldn't start off by just churning out prime forms and interval class vectors. There will be a time for that later, after we've come to a more holistic sense of the piece. I'm also going to forbid another common way of starting off a song analysis, reading the text. Again, we will get there eventually. The text definitely is important, but it's also often the case that jumping too quickly to what the text means can sometimes box us into an interpretation too quickly, which can in turn shut out other useful ways of interpreting the piece. So instead, we're going to structure our analysis around the following 5-step process, which I'm adapting from an essay on song analysis by Kofi Agawu. First, listen with intention, collecting as many significant musical features as possible. Second, use an explicit method to generate more data and revise or reorganize your initial observations. 3, begin interpreting by developing metaphors for purely musical features of the song. 4, bring these metaphors into dialogue with the poetic text. And finally, 5th, prune your observations to a manageable number and connect them together into a focused essay with a central argument. In the rest of this video, we're going to walk through each of these stages in great detail. And you can see on screen the timestamps for each individual part. So step 1, Listen with intention. Our first step should always be to listen with our ears completely open to whatever might strike us as interesting about this piece. This listening should be purposeful, as though you were a detective hunting for clues to unravel a crime scene, but it doesn't have to be especially technical at this stage. So let's give Berg's song an initial listen, but as you listen, see if you can come up with 5 interesting observations about this piece. 5 things that really stand out to you as particularly unique or compelling about it. I'll share mine after we hear it, but I'll stress again, these are just my own. Your observations could well be different, and if so, you'll likely be led to different analytical conclusions later on down the line. But enough talk, let's listen.
Sahst du nach dem Gewitterregen den Wald? Alles rastet, blinkt und ist schön. Als zuvor. Auch du brauchst Gewitterregen.
Here are my 5. First, the voice is totally alone for the first 2 measures, almost as though you and the singer were the only ones in the room. Second, the whole piece rarely rises above a piano dynamic. It seems almost whispered in your ear. At the same time, however, this is also a very dramatic, one might even say operatic song. And indeed, the third thing I noticed was that bubbling melisma in measure 5, which sticks out against the largely syllabic setting of the rest of the song. This is a song that's soft and intimate, but also intense and charged with emotion. And the fourth thing I noticed was perhaps the most emotionally charged moment in the entire piece, that amazing melodic gesture in measure 8. Not only is that the melodic climax of the piece, but I also note that it's the softest. It's the first time we get a dynamic marking for the vocalist, and it's triple piano, once again speaking to a sense of whispered intensity. Lastly, while I wasn't necessarily listening that hard for motives, one did pop into my ear, the singer's last 4 notes, which are identical to the first 4 notes sung in measure 2. While many of the motives we have looked at in this unit can be hidden or difficult to hear, this one sticks out like a sore thumb, partly because the leap that takes us into measure 2 was really beautiful, which made it stick in my memory, but also because the climactic gesture from measure 8 is almost the same motive. Almost the same 4 notes, in fact. Only the last one is different. It's a B natural instead of a B flat. And we could go on. 5 is really just a starting point. Already I hope you see that there's so much in this music to appreciate, so many expressive musical devices to explore. You can and should chase observations like these until you basically run out of steam. And you should also connect things together when you can. Our observation that we begin with the singer by itself may prompt us to search for other places where the singer is unsupported by an orchestra. And wouldn't you know it, the climax in measure 8 is the only other spot in the song that lacks accompaniment. Maybe now that we've identified an important motive, we could pick out other instances of it. I note, for instance, that the entire vocal line in measures 8 through 10 is echoed verbatim by the cello, who carries the melody forward one more step by resolving, if we want to call it that, the vocal line's final E up to an F. And we could go on and on and on and on like this. So the point is, we don't actually need set theory to at least begin making musical observations about this or any atonal piece. Similarly, you don't need a text to at least begin sketching out an expressive narrative about a song. Your ears are musical, so use them, follow them. None of the things I've pointed out so far are particularly opaque or complicated. Most of them are things you could have probably noticed about the piece long before you took this class. They are straightforward, audible features of what makes this music sound the way that it does. And our analyses should always begin there, to make sure that we are always anchored to what is musically evocative about a piece of music. But eventually, your informal observations will start to run dry. And this is where you should enter the next stage of the analysis: formal data gathering. This is where the tools of set theory will finally come into play. These tools will not only help you generate more observations and materials for your eventual essay, but they'll also serve as a check on your own subjectivity, covering your blind spots and helping you hear things that you might never have paid attention to on your own. We've seen this process at work before, as when in our week 2 video, we saw that just labeling pitch classes can make hidden motives pop out, or that sketching a melody's unordered pitch intervals could draw our attention to a process of melodic expansion, for instance. You never know what a tool might reveal to you, so be thorough and experimental. You'll probably find a bunch of paths that you think will be interesting, but will end up leading you to dead ends. Other times, a path that seems wrong-headed or not very intuitive may reveal something really, really interesting. Just keep track of anything and everything you find, because you might need it later. So this is where the real labor of analysis begins. I probably spent a solid 3 hours on this, just generating as much data as possible. It can at times seem tedious and disorganized, but the eventual payoff of this work will be that you'll have more raw materials to forge interpretations from in the next step. The more work you put in here, the more robust and interesting your final analyses are likely to be. Still, I don't think it will be helpful to go through my entire process, but let me highlight at least 3 parts of it, showing you first where I began the analysis, and then discussing 2 passages in detail, one that fit some of the initial hypotheses of mine, and one which was harder to wrestle with. As I've emphasized repeatedly, set theory is really useful for 2 basic things: analyzing motives and describing unfamiliar sounds in precise ways. And we've already identified one motive, as well as a portion of the music where the song is at its simplest, the opening, where there's only a melody and no harmonies. So I started my systematic analysis of the piece by isolating that opening vocal phrase and playing around with it, just to see what our tools might reveal about it. So here we see that passage in isolation.
Sahst du nach dem Gewitterregen den Wald?
What do you do with this? Well, we could start by translating the melody into pitch class integers and calculating the 4 kinds of intervals. In this case, this process helped me notice one important detail. I was able to see that the first 3 notes and the last 3 notes are inversions of each other. In the language of set theory, we could describe this relationship as an inversion around a mirror that cuts the clock face north to south, which we could supply with a label like I, C to C. And by doing this, we've already initiated another important part of the analysis process: segmenting a passage into sets and examining their properties. I should emphasize something at this point, which is that really, set theory doesn't tell you how to slice up a passage. There isn't anything in the theory itself that tells you, okay, divide these 10 pitch classes into this set over here and this other one over here, or something like that. What you have to do is use your musical intuitions. This, by the way, is precisely why we started with intuitive and open listening rather than jumping to this part, because now we have some intuitions that we could use to guide our segmentation. One of our initial observations was that the first 4 notes of measure 2 are an important motive, and this gives us a natural way of breaking up this passage into 3 segments: a 5-note set in measure 1, our 4-note motive in measure 2, and then the final 3 notes. Likewise, by starting with an intervallic analysis, we were able to see that this 5-note set in the first measure contains a 3-note subset that is in the same set class as our last segment. All this ensures that our set analyses remain hooked up to things that feel intuitively musical to us. But now it's time to label our stuff, because by calculating the normal order, prime form, and interval class vector for all 3 sets, we get a list of musical features to track throughout the rest of the piece. Where else do these sets and their attendant musical features appear? How are they transformed and combined? Do these sets account for all of the musical stuff in this piece? Or are there places where the music shifts to very different materials? These are the questions that are going to frame the rest of our set theory investigation. and we already have some clue to them. We have seen that 014 appears twice in this passage, so it would be a good idea to check and track that set class in the rest of the piece. And as it turns out, 014 does indeed saturate this song. I won't bore you with all the details, but you can find roughly 50 instances of this set class strewn about the song's 11 measures. By way of contrast, the 0167 motive for measure 2 appears only 5 times, though 7 if you count its 2 distorted appearances around measure 8. And this shouldn't surprise us. We've come to expect atonal composers to build their pieces on a small number of 3-note set classes, in the same way tonal composers built theirs on major and minor chords. Hence, merely identifying 014 as the song's basic set class isn't particularly interesting on its own. Just like saying, this aria by Mozart uses mostly major and minor chords isn't all that interesting. So to generate some more useful data, we should first see how the song's sets are spun out and transformed into a variety of different musical shapes. And second, look closely at any passages that aren't constructed out of the set classes we extracted to see what's going on there. Let's begin with the first of these, isolating measures 3 through 5 and seeing how it's put together.
Den Wald, alles rastet, blinkt und ist schön.
In this passage, every single note is part of the 014 motive. Pick any note in this passage and you can plug it into either a melodic or harmonic presentation of this set class. But really, the backbone of this passage, at least in my hearing, is that ascending gesture that starts on a low B and carries us up to the G-B dyad at the end of the passage. A gesture spun out of a pair of ascending sequences generated from chains of 014s. As shown at the bottom of the screen, those sequences are made of alternating major third ascents with semitone descents. And Berg runs this sequence once starting on B, and then runs it again starting on G. In your JIT for this week, you'll construct a similar sequence out of the motive you made for your composition project. So let's dig in here and examine how this sequence works, learning in the process about some of the relationships that Strauss highlights in the textbook chapter you will read for this week. This is the one part of the video that everybody in the class needs to watch very closely. So, one of the nice things about this sequence is that it presents the 014 motive in a lot of different ways. For instance, you can think about the sequence as a chain of 014s related by T3, with the final note of one presentation welded as a common tone to the next. In week 3, we learned that you can use a set's interval class vector to figure out how to make chains like this, since it shows us the number of common tones that result from transposing a set by a given interval class. This is what Strauss calls common tones under transposition at the very start of chapter 3. Since the set class 014 has 1s in the IC 1, 3, and 4 slot of its interval class vector, transposing the set by any of those intervals would produce a sequential chain like this. Here are 2 other chains Berg could have made if he transposed a set by one of these other ICs. For instance, by 1 or by 4. But this sequence could also be viewed in other ways too. For instance, one could think of the sequence as a chain of inverted versions of the set class that share 2 common tones, essentially holding on to 2 pitch classes and then flipping the other one to the pitch class that would be found in the inverted form of the set. This is another thing that your textbook discusses at length on pages 103 through 107. But as with other discussions of inversion, try not to get too tangled up in the weeds here. As always, I just want you to be able to spot when 2 sets are related by inversion, and to use whatever inversion label helps you call attention to a musical feature that seems salient. In this case, I used inversion labels that allowed me to pinpoint which notes were held in common between different parts of the chained sequence. And finally, you could also think of the sequence as a non-overlapping set of major thirds separated by T3. Berg exploits this feature of the sequence too. Notice that the passage starts by treating the sequence entirely melodically, but by the end, it has turned into a string of major third dyads. Combined with the gradual shortening of rhythms across these measures, this gives the whole passage a feeling of acceleration, with new pitches trickling in slowly at the beginning, then rushing intensely at the end. And it's these sorts of observations that the tools of set theory are useful in picking out. I probably did pick up intuitively on a sense of rhythmic acceleration here, but the way that this acceleration included shifting presentations of a sequence wasn't something that I noticed initially. But that's the thing, I can notice it now on a subsequent rehearing. So now, let's listen to the passage again with this in mind, paying attention to the way its accelerating surface rhythms are coordinated with a gradual compression of the sequence from a melodic to a harmonic presentation.
Wen alles rastet, blinkt und ist schön.
Now, in your JIT for this week, I want you to try spinning your own chord out into a sequence like this, thinking similarly about how you could start a sequential process and then shift its presentation to achieve a kind of acceleration, deceleration, or some other nice musical effect. Zooming back out, I'll mention in passing that all this happens in pseudo reverse in the final section. There, the orchestra runs through a descending and decelerating sequence made out of 0-1-4 chains. And this in turn reveals another nice piece of data for me, helping me notice a kind of palindromic structure where the second half of the song kind of unwinds a lot of the musical processes of the first. At this point, I'm nearing the end of my set class analysis. I'm starting to get a really good picture of how this song is put together, and I'm almost ready to turn to interpreting that structure. But there's one more passage we have to deal with first. Measures 5 through 7, where I couldn't find any 0-1-4s or 0-1-6-7s. It's important to make sure you analyze these passages too, not just the ones that use the set classes that you found. Because of course, contrast is an important musical effect. And if we ignore contrasting musical passages, just because they don't make use of the motives that we picked out, then we are missing a huge part of what makes this song work the way that it does. So if this passage isn't based on our motives, then what is it based on? Well, singling it out, I noticed a couple interesting things about it, which I'll go through quickly. First of all, the passage alternates two chords over a pedal point on the pitch class D flat. On their own, these two chords don't appear to have much motivic significance, though we should recognize that this is just one song within a larger collection, and it might be that this passage and its sets reference materials from other songs. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but what is certainly true is that within the context of this particular song, these are not sets that occur anywhere else. And so we should highlight the ways that it contrasts the sounds we hear elsewhere in the song. In particular, I note that by combining these two 3-note sets into a larger 5-note superset, which is a concept Strauss discusses on pages 121 through 124, we can see that this passage is based largely on whole tones, in sharp contrast to the half-steppy minor 30 materials in the rest of the song. So this is in fact a very different sound world altogether. On top of this, I also hear some vaguely tonal things going on here. There's a weird sense in which this passage feels like it's trying to be in B-flat major. The chord measure 7, for instance, sounds suspiciously like a root position dominant 7th chord built on F, with the F sharp in the highest voice maybe standing inharmonically for a flat 9 chordal extension. Likewise, the voice can almost be fit into a B-flat major scale, and it even arpeggiates a B-flat major triad at the start of the passage. Once again, I'm not quite sure yet what the significance of all this is, but this is what I come up with when I force myself to account for every single note in the piece. And that, we should keep in mind, is the point of this stage of the analysis. And that process is now largely complete. If you pointed to any note in this piece, I could now find a structure that it plugs into. Once you're able to do that, you can pat yourself on the back and take a breather, because you're essentially done with the heavy music theory portion of your analysis. But now it's our task to take the sets and musical relationships we've uncovered and compile them into an interpretation. And this is where the fun begins, because now we get to start thinking about the expressive implications of all the stuff we've uncovered. Implications we can work out by developing metaphors for these purely musical devices. Stage 3. In this stage, you're going to try to translate as many of the song's musical features as you can into metaphorical, non technical language. When combined with a small handful of musical details, this will result in a distinctive narrative that is specific to this piece. It's here where we will be able to define what this piece does in a way that hopefully feels both rooted in specific musical features, but also intuitive and expressive. This is where you will uncover what you hear in a very real sense. And because this is not yet our final analysis, we shouldn't be afraid of spitballing here. Don't worry yet about being totally coherent. Any metaphors that work for the musical materials you are working with are valid at this stage, and we will whittle them down later. For instance, what are all the possible ways that we could expressively characterize the singer in relation to the orchestra? Here are some possibilities that come to my mind. She is human, where the orchestra is instrumental. She is an individual, whereas the orchestra is a collective. She speaks text and hence communicates concrete meaning, where the orchestra can only express pure, ineffable music. She articulates whatever is said, whereas the orchestra paints the rich emotions and thoughts underneath that speech, and so on and so forth. This is the kind of activity you're engaging in this stage of the analysis. And you might bring things from other genres you're experienced with. Coming from the world of opera, for instance, I want to interpret the melisma in measure 5 as a place where the voice becomes like an instrument, a place where words and reason fail her and pure emotion takes over. But maybe you have different metaphors here. But the point is, similar to our set class analysis, you should ideally strive to be exhaustive here. Strive to interpret absolutely everything, leaving no expressive rock unturned. In particular, think creatively about what metaphors effectively describe those motivic processes you meticulously uncovered during stage 2. Our opening phrase, as we saw, has a 3-part structure, with the outer parts articulating the 014 motive and the central one giving us the 0167. What could we hear expressively here? A process interrupted, perhaps? Or maybe one motive being contained or trapped by another? I think I like that metaphor, in part because we could think of the final phrase as expressing an inverted state of affairs, with 2 statements of 0167 flanking a central passage that uses 014s. And handily, we have already come up with some metaphors to characterize the remainder of the song. The orchestra takes up the 014 motive from the end of the vocal phrase and obsesses over it, churning out a sequence that gradually rises, growing in intensity and energy. At the apex of that process, we enter a new musical world, a transfigured, perhaps dreamlike, whole tone zone. Thereafter, the music subsequently unwinds the 014 sequence, like a drawn-out sigh or something. As for the canonic imitation between voice and cello, maybe we hear this as expressing some sort of newfound agreement between orchestra and voice. This is a suggestive set of metaphors, and I'm mostly happy with it. But one thing that it doesn't really cover, that I'd really like it to, is that quasi 5-7 chord in measure 7. One of 3 prominent appearances of a low F throughout the movement. That seems significant to me, but I don't really know what to do with it. So what narrative could I construct for this? Here's what I'm thinking. There's an important sense in which the opening of the song is always sort of moving away from B flat. Notice especially that B flat is the only note that appears twice in the opening phrase. The first time, it escapes up to B natural. And the second time, it escapes downward to A natural. So B flat is clearly set up at the beginning as something unstable that the music is always escaping from. Could we hear this process, like so many others in the song, as sort of reversing in the second half? When the climactic warped version of the 0167 motive lands on that B natural, could we hear it as missing B flat by a half step, and then subsequently correcting itself down a half step, and coming to some sort of rest on B flat. What I basically am hearing here is that B natural to B flat move in the final phrase as somehow undoing the move from B flat to B natural that started the whole song, transforming B flat from an unstable point of departure to a stable point of arrival. On its own, I think this narrative is a bit far fetched. Too much time separates measure 1 from measure 8 for me, making it hard to draw this mental connection. But when we plug that 5-7 into the narrative, I think it becomes a lot more convincing. Because as a dominant chord, it instills a longing for a B flat resolution. And it becomes a lot easier to then hear the voice landing on a wrong note and delaying B flat as a resolution until measure 9. Basically, this narrative asks us to hear things like this. And that's a hearing I think I can get behind. In any case, we have then a set of metaphors that accounts expressively for pretty much every note in the piece. What in our earlier stage was a set of formal relationships between musical sets has now become a sequence of expressive events tied up in a couple of narratives. In the process, we have found ways to integrate our exhaustive set-based analysis with the intuitive musical observations we made at the start. In a very real sense, this is pretty close to how I hear the piece. It captures not only the musical relationships I now hear in this song, but also what I think those relationships sort of mean, what significance they have for me in the telling of a complete musical story. With these stories in hand, let's listen to the piece one more time to see if you can hear it the way I do.
Sahst du nach dem Gewitter Regen den Wald, alles rastet, blinkt und ist schön. Alles zu Auch du brauchst Gewitterregen.
But we are also not quite done. We still haven't actually connected this narrative to the text. So let's do that now in this, the final stage of our analysis before we set to writing, developing a contextual reading of the text. An English translation of the text is shown on screen, which I'll read now. Did you see after the storm's rain the forest? Everything rests, shines, and is more beautiful than before. See, woman, you too need storm rain. So why did we put the text off until the last stage? Well, for starters, I hope you see that we haven't really lost anything by doing so. In fact, because we've already done our musical analysis, we were able to make a ton of connections between poetry and music right away. For instance, that contrasting whole tony sound world we enter in measure 5 could easily be connected to the radically altered appearance of the forest following a storm. Likewise, remember how the orchestra spins out the singer's 014 motive into an accelerating sequential passage? Notice that this process starts the very moment that the voice sings the word Wald, forest. So we might say that this spinning out musically enacts what goes on in the poem's second line. It seizes upon, elaborates, and spins out the image of the forest that is established at the end of the first line. In other words, the sonic tangle of 014s grows right alongside our visual image of the forest in the poetry. But what about that unraveling process in the final phrase? What about the relationship between 014 and 0167, set up in the first phrase and then reversed in the last? And what about the narrative involving B flat and the 5-7 chord? It's a little less obvious how these features might be connected to features of the poetry. They don't really seem to fit easily into its story. Indeed, The main reason we put off the text to the end is so we wouldn't be blinded to these important features of what the piece does. It is all too common for students to focus exclusively on how the music supports the text, which often causes them to ignore parts of the music that don't easily fit into those interpretations. But we, on the other hand, have forced ourselves into a position where we have narrative threads in the music that don't neatly align with the poetry. And that in turn forces us to think creatively about how we are going to bring the two together. How exactly the music's seemingly independent logic is going to interface with the poems. And it is in knitting those apparently incompatible threads together that we finally come to an interpretation of the complete song that is uniquely our own. It is there that we put the final interpretive touch on our analysis. So here's the way I knit things together. Here's an interpretation that makes sense to me. In the text, the first two lines build up a metaphor, and the last line decodes it, bringing forth its central point and giving the reader a flash of personal insight. We, like forests, are not only capable of surviving the destructive storms that thunder through our lives, but in fact, those very storms are necessary for our existence, allowing us to grow and flourish. I might suggest that the music participates in this process of decoding in several ways. For instance, while only the final line of the poem makes a connection that you are the forest, I would point out that in the music, you and forest are linked from the start. Since both the initial you verb, zast, and the word forest, wald, are cast as 014s in the opening vocal phrase. You and the forest are linked motivically from the very beginning. Hence, the final line's revelation is motivically seated in the very first musical phrase. Likewise, if we read the ascending sequence as taking us into the world of the forest, then the reversal of that process over the last phrase could be seen as enacting an exit out of that image and a return to the real world, where we finally interpret what that image does for us. And that leaves only the B-flat resolution narrative. Here, I want to point out how this story parallels the actual experience of metaphorical parables like this, in which the listener begins with an unknowingly incomplete or inadequate view of the world, and then on hearing the metaphorical revelation, they gain a new perspective on themselves and the world, radically altering how they think and feel. From this angle, what happens to B-flat in this song is analogous to what happens to someone who hears an insightful metaphor. The song changes its perspective on B-flat, transforming it from something volatile and unstable to something longed for and satisfying. And this is just like how the poetic metaphor asks us to change our view of emotional storms from something that is destructive and unwanted to something we should welcome and embrace. And this is the final piece of my narrative, a mapping between the song's large-scale process of reframing B-flat and the process of metaphorical reframing that is embodied by the poetic metaphor itself. B-flat as tonic is the newfound knowledge we gain at the end of the metaphor. And with that, I have a reasonably complete way of understanding how the song's musical and poetic materials interact. And now, at long last, I'd be ready to sit down and write out my analysis. I have a story to tell about this piece now. A story in which a protagonist unknowingly longs for self-fulfillment, and through an aphoristic musical transformation, discovers and attains what was missing from her life. But what we've uncovered is probably far more than what can be stuffed into a 3 to 5 page paper. So I'd need to prune this analysis down to its central ideas and think carefully about how to communicate those ideas effectively to someone who doesn't hear the music in this way. In this video, I've taken you along for the ride as I uncovered literally everything that I think about this piece. But I think you'll probably agree that the result is messy, unfocused, and pretty boring. This is not what I would want my essay to look like. In short, if the name of the game in previous stages was try to find everything, the name of the game in its final stage is, paradoxically, don't try to say everything. This may seem a little contradictory, but of course it's a big part of writing well. You're always able to think more than you can effectively write about, so don't try to pack everything in here. Rather, use the new knowledge you have to make a small number of points in a really effective manner. So, if I were going to translate all of this stuff into an actual essay, I'd want to find a compelling angle from which I could communicate most of the musical stuff I hear in this song. There are several ways to do this depending on what part of your interpretation you think is the most important. Rarely is the most effective path just to start at the beginning of the song and narrate what happens in it. Just like the most effective literary interpretations are rarely the ones that just describe a novel from beginning to end. For me, I think I'd want to center my essay on measure 8. This measure participates in a large number of the musical and narrative processes I've identified here. It's the song's climax, it's where the poem's central metaphor begins to be explained, it's where the whole tone sounds of the previous measures are shattered, it's where the motive for measure 2 comes back in its warped form, and it's also where the music starts to hone back in on B flat following the preceding 5/7 chord. So by writing a 3 to 5 page essay that just tries to explain all the things that are going on structurally and expressively in measure 8, its motivations, we might say, I would wind up with an essay that has to touch on almost all of the analyses and interpretations I've uncovered in this video. This is precisely what I mean by finding a good angle, something that gives your essay focus, allowing you to say a lot in a short amount of space. As with everything, there is no one size fits all solution here. The way your essay looks will depend on what point you're trying to communicate, what story you're telling, and how best to tell it. In any case, I hope that the 5-stage process of analysis I've sketched here will prove useful to you. To recap, I encourage you to begin your analysis by listening closely, coming up with at least 5 things you think are musically interesting about the song. Next, you should undertake a systematic analysis of the whole piece to uncover a store of hidden musical details and subtle relationships. Use the tools we've discussed in class and in your textbook here, and aim for a reasonably exhaustive excavation of musical relationships. After this, you should work out an equally exhaustive set of expressive metaphors for all the musical relationships you have uncovered, forming a reasonably complete picture of the musical story you think the piece tells. Then, bring that story into dialogue with the poetry, using its images to help you sharpen your expressive metaphors, and also using your musical knowledge to read the poetry in new or non-obvious ways. Having acquired a nuanced and multifaceted view of the song, you would then be ready to select a handful of musical observations that you think are really cool and write a focused 3 to 5 page essay about them. This process will take time and effort. I envision the analysis process taking roughly the same amount of time that you would typically budget to studying for a big exam. It's just that instead of memorizing terms and reviewing core concepts, you will spend your time instead studying a single song in great musical detail and working out your analysis. Similarly, I would expect the actual writing process to take about the same amount of time as sitting down to take an exam, so about 50 minutes of focused time in front of the word processor. Your mileage may vary, of course, but I think about 6 solid hours of work, about half of which would be spent in stage 2 of the process, would be plenty of time to produce an excellent essay. So don't kill yourselves here, but do consider this as a major project that requires your focused time and effort. So best of luck! I look forward to getting to know you and the way you hear music better through your analyses.